All right, well, welcome back to Book of Revelations 1.2, or part 1.2. Okay. All right, so we are actually going to open the Bible now, only 1 hour into our first class, right? Of course, we're going to open our Bible entirely opposite end from the Book of Revelation, because we want to look at examples of this genre of dreams, visions, and symbolic stories, right? So we're gonna look at these. So we're actually gonna get started. I'm gonna be looking at we're in Genesis 30. Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37. Now, just a quick note on this. I will give you chapters and verses. I cannot give you page numbers because I'm using a different Bible. Well, almost all of us many of us are using different Bibles. So page numbers don't match up. That's why different versions of the Bible have different page numbers, so therefore you're going to want to, but you're going to be looking for Genesis chapter 37, and I'm technically starting on, basically verse 1. So again, the whole point of this one is that we're looking at different examples of dreams, mystical visions, messages from God, stories with kind of symbolic meaning to them. That's kind of what we're going for here, right? All right. This is not the earliest, but it's one of the earliest, and I think quite useful for our purposes to get started with someone who's famous in the Bible for being someone who has dreams and can interpret dreams. So this is Joseph. Now, again, just as a kind of grounding point in here, remember it's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then Jacob has his 12 sons, and Joseph is one of the 12 sons of Jacob, and those become the 12 tribes of Israel, right? So we're very early in the Bible, and if you want to be able to know which Joseph this is, Joseph with the coat of many colors, right? That Joseph, right? Okay. So I'm just going to read through this one. We're not going to do full interpretations and exegesis of these passages, but we're going to highlight a couple things about what we notice of how dreams work in the Bible, right? And the messages that come from them. Okay. So I'm starting verse 1, starting the part where it says, this is the story of Joseph. Joseph was 17 years old. As he was young, he was shepherding the flock with his brothers, with the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. And Joseph brought his father bad reports about them. All right. So Joseph is the tattletale of all of his brothers. Jacob, the father, loved Joseph more than all of his other sons, for he was the son of his old age, and he had a decorated tunic made for him, the coat of many colors. But his brothers, seeing how much his father loved him more than the other sons, came to hate him so much that they could not say a civil word to him. Now Joseph had a dream, and he repeated the dream to his brothers, who had hated him then more than ever. Listen, he said, to the dream that I had. We were binding sheaves in the field, when my sheaf suddenly rose and stood upright. And then your sheaves gathered around and bowed down to my sheaf. I don't know why he thought this was a good idea to share with his brothers. Seriously, this guy is like either asking for trouble or just oblivious to like his, the social cues around him, right? All right. So your sheaves will bow to the ground before my sheaf. And then so they respond, so you will be king over us, his brothers retorted. You want to lord it over us? And they hated him even more on account of his dreams and what he said. He had another dream. which he recounted to his brothers. Look, I have had another dream, he said. There were the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down to me. He told his father and his brother, and his father scolded him. A fine dream to have, he said. Are all of us then, myself and your mother and your brothers, to come to bow down to the ground before you? His brothers held it against him, and his father pondered on the matter. Okay, so he's got these dreams, and here we get to see, I mean, this seems to be, on many levels, like just sort of, almost the sort of dreams that you would expect to find, right? Right? Like, he lives in a farming community, so, you know, there, he says, we were dreaming that we were out cutting down, you know, the crops and putting them into sheaves, and then one of them stands up, and then the other ones all bow down to it, and he's like, and that was mine, was the one in the middle, and then all the other ones are my brothers bowing down to it. And it's like, well, that's crazy. Like, that doesn't happen in real life, but in dreams, that kind of makes a certain sense, right? Like, if you ever remember your dreams, you know that it's often things that just happen during your day, but then start acting in ways that can't happen in real life, right? But there's a kind of a meaning to it. So now Joseph here doesn't give a meaning to this per se, right? But his brothers and his father, right? And then the second one is about the sun and the moon and the stars, right? And so he's there, and then the sun and the moon, presumably, like, it doesn't say this specifically, but you get the impression that the sun and the moon represent his father and his mother, and then the other stars represent his brothers, and they're all bowing down to him, right? I don't know how you do that. How does the sun bow?
Yeah.
It doesn't, I don't know.
In his dream.
In his dream it works, right? Okay, so his brothers held it against him, but his fathers pondered on his matter, right? Now, we never hear specifically an interpretation of this dream later on. But as it turns out, if you know the story of Joseph, right? Joseph, quick notes here on the story of Joseph. Joseph, his brothers eventually get so upset with him, they sell him into slavery down in Egypt, right? But through a series of events, and we're going to get to a couple of those here in just a second, Joseph becomes the right-hand man to the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, right? And so Joseph is this, very important figure. And so it turns out that when there's a famine going throughout the land, all of Joseph's brothers and his father and his family all have to come to Egypt to be able to come get food, and they all bow down before him because they don't recognize him.
So the dream came true.
So the dream came true. Yes. Right? So it's like, okay, so that was not a normal dream, right? It sort of acted like a normal dream because it was this sort of stuff that you would sort of expect to happen in a dream was happening there, but yet it came true. Okay. I also want to look at Genesis chapter 40. So we're going to go a couple pages forward and look at another passage about Joseph again. This is during the middle of Joseph's story where he is been sold as a slave into Egypt, but now he's getting an opportunity to rise up in Egypt and come from being a slave to being the Pharaoh's right-hand man. But it comes because of dreams. So let's go ahead and take a look at this one here. I'm on number 40, chapter 40. It happened sometime later that the king of Egypt's cupbearer and his baker offended the master, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them into custody in the house of the commander of the guard, in the gaol where Joseph was a prisoner. So the prison where Joseph was a prisoner. And the commander of the guard assigned Joseph to them to attend to their wants while they remain in custody for some time. Now both of them had dreams on the same night, each with its own meaning for the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were prisoners in that prison. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they looked gloomy, and he asked the two officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why these sad looks today?" And they replied, "We've each had a dream, but there is no one here to interpret it. Are not interpretations God business?" And Joseph asked them, "Tell me about them then." So the chief cupbearer described his dream to Joseph, telling him, "In my dream there was a vine in front of me. On the vine were 3 branches, and no sooner had it budded than it blossomed, and its clusters became ripe grapes. I had Pharaoh's cup in my hand, and I picked the grapes, and I squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and I put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. This is what it means, Joseph told him. The 3 branches are 3 days. In another 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head by restoring you to your position. And then you will hand Pharaoh his cup, as you did before when you were his official cupbearer. But be sure to kindly remember me when things go well for you, and keep faith with me by kindly reminding Pharaoh about me to get me out of this house, this prison. He was under house arrest. I was kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews in the first place, and even here I've done nothing to warrant being put into this dungeon. The baker said, the chief baker, seeing the interpretation had been favorable, said to Joseph, I too had a dream. There were 3 wicker trays on my head. In the top tray were all kinds of pastries for Pharaoh, such as a baker might make. And the birds were eating them off the tray on my head. And Joseph replied to him as follows, This is what it means. The 3 trays are 3 days. In another 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up by your head by hanging you on a gallows, and the birds will eat the flesh off your bones. And so it happened that the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a banquet for all his officials. And of his officials, he lifted up the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. The chief cupbearer was lifted up by restoring him to cupbearing, so that he handed again Pharaoh his cup, and by the hanging the chief baker, as Joseph had explained to him. But the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. He had forgotten him, right? Okay. So Joseph is able to interpret dreams. This continues on to 41. I'm not going to read the whole thing here. I'm just going to give the Cliff's Notes version of it. So the whole chapter of 41, Pharaoh now has a dream. And so he doesn't know how to interpret it. And then all of a sudden the cupbearer is like, hey, I remember there was this guy who's really good at interpreting dreams, and it came true. So let's bring this guy up so that he can be able to interpret your dream, Pharaoh. And the dream was that, let me see here. In the dream, there I was, standing on the banks of the Nile, and there were 7 cows, fat and sleek, coming up from the Nile, and they began to feed among the rushes. And then 7 other cows came up behind them, starved and very wretched and lean. I'd never seen such poor cows in all of Egypt. The lean and wretched cows ate up the 7 fat cows. And then there's a similar sort of thing with 7 stalks of grain, right? And Joseph interprets this and says, here's what's going to happen, Pharaoh. 7 years, you're going to have years of plenty, fat, sleek. Everything's going to go well. Good crops, good, everything like that. He says, but then we're going to have 7 years of drought afterwards, right? And Pharaoh's like, well, this is, Pharaoh's very impressed by this. He's been given a good recommendation by the cupbearer. So he says, all right, Joseph, I'm going to put you in charge of taking care of the official food stores, so that we can make sure that we have enough to get through the famine. And again, I told you the story about how later on Joseph's family comes into Egypt and they bow down before him specifically because Egypt had food during the famine, and it was because Joseph had planned for it, right? He got this message from the dreams, and he was able to interpret it correctly and be able to predict the future in this way, right? So this is clearly understood in this part that this is sort of a specific talent that was given to Joseph, and that these dreams were not normal dreams, right? They were messages from God, right? There was a specific message from God in these dreams. And that he had the ability, and Joseph has this ability to interpret dreams. And this is one of the things that happens in the Bible, on a couple different occasions. Not everybody has this, but many people have this ability to kind of read and interpret dreams. And these dreams have they're not normal dreams. They have a message to them, right? Something like that, okay? All right, so that's everything I wanted to say about Joseph. Again, what we're trying to do is we're going to go through like a whole bunch of different passages through the Bible just to get ourselves a feel for what different dreams and messages and so on and so forth look like, right? Okay. So we're going to jump to the next one. I want to look at Moses. So we're going to be in the book of Exodus in chapter 3. So that'll be a few pages ahead of where you are right now. Get past the end of Genesis and then into Exodus chapter 3. Okay, very famous passage. Moses in the burning bush, right? Okay. So, beginning chapter 3. Moses was looking after the flock of his father-in-law and Jethro, priest of Midian. He led it out to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame blazing in the middle of a bush. Moses looked, there was the bush blazing, but the bush was not being burnt up. All right. Moses said, I must go across to go see this strange sight and why the bush is not being burned up. When the Lord saw him going across to look, God called to him from the middle of the bush, Moses, Moses. He said, here I am. He answered, come no nearer, take off your sandals, for this place where you are standing is holy ground. I am the God of your ancestors, he said, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And at this, Moses covered his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Okay. So, there's a little bit more, but just to kind of see what's going on here, right? Moses is having a vision here, right? It's not a dream, per se, because he's walking, he's covering his face, right? He's not asleep, right? But he is having an encounter with God that is, you know, a vision. I mean, first of all, there's an angel that's sitting on this bush, and it's on fire, but it's not being consumed. So it's kind of I don't know. There's something that's almost kind of like that. That feels almost dreamlike to it, doesn't it? Like the idea of like something that's on fire but not burning down, right? Like an impossible sort of thing that like happens, like what happens in dreams, you know. So maybe there's something to this. Maybe he's doing this, but at the same time, maybe he's in, he's being drawn up into some sort of a spiritual trance or something like this to be able to encounter this in a way that is beyond normal human senses, something like that, right? It's not particularly clear exactly what's happening here, but we get the message, right? Okay. So here he is. Moses is now prostrate on holy ground, right? Bowing his head, shoes off his feet, and he's talking with God in the burning bush. The Lord then said, I've seen the misery of my people Egypt. I've heard them crying on account of their taskmasters. Yes, I'm well aware of their suffering, and I've come down to rescue them from the clutches of the Egyptians to bring them up out of that country, a country rich and broad, to a country flowing with milk and honey, to the home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Yes, indeed, the Israelites' cry for help has reached me, and I have also seen the cruel way in which the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now I'm sending you to Pharaoh, for you will bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Moses said to God, who am I to go to Pharaoh and to bring the Israelites out of Egypt? God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign by which you know that I was the one who sent you. After you have let my people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain, right? So this mountain is also the same place where they would go and worship God, and I think that's where they get the Ten Commandments as well. Moses then said to God, look, if I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your ancestors has sent me, they will say to me, what is his name? What am I to tell them? God said to Moses, I am who am, or I am who is. It's a different, there's slight variations on it. It's very, very difficult to translate that. He said, this is what you are saying to the Israelites, I am has sent you, or has sent me to you. God further said to Moses, you are to tell the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name for all time, and thus I am to be invoked for all generations to come. Okay. So we have another experience here of someone having a mystical vision, right, and a message. This one is although it has some sort of dreamlike elements to it, it's also very straightforward, right? Like there's none of this like, 7 cows and then 7 more cows and then they eat the other cows and, and stuff like that. There's none of that business. It's like, nope, here's the game plan. You're going to go to Pharaoh. You're going to do this. How will I be able to convince the people? You will tell them my name. And then God reveals his name, which is a big, big deal. Well, I can't get into all of it, but it's a big deal that this is the moment that God reveals his name to his people, right? It's kind of an oblique name, I am who I am. Like you can't define God, but God just is. God is God, something like that, right? So we see in this a new type of thing, right? Message, very clear, and Moses is now being sent out with this message, right? An encounter with the fire of God, the Spirit of God, the angel of the Lord, right? Okay. We're going to keep moving forward.
So what's your opinion of if they thought it was real or not? I mean, because, Moses, he had a pretty good thing going with his family and...
Yeah, he had just escaped Egypt. He did not want to go back.
Yeah, I know. And so here he has this vision or dream, and he had to be questioning it.
Right, there's a certain point of did I imagine this? Mm-hmm. Right, like maybe there was something of that. I mean, it doesn't go into the mindset of Moses. So whatever we would do would be kind of speculation at this point. I mean, it does follow eventually. All right, what was given to him. So obviously he took it serious enough, in that way. He transformed his whole life to go out and go fulfill this. Let me keep that in the back of my mind here a little bit, because we might talk a little bit about mystical prayer and kind of how that, because that's still a thing that happens, today, right? Like mystical prayer experiences and stuff like that. People will get a word from...
The Holy Spirit was probably encouraging him to do it.
Yeah, but that's precisely what it is.
God first gave him the message, and the Holy Spirit kept working on him.
Right. That's precisely what it is, and you get this...
And he needs to obey. I mean, that's part of, so while he's like, okay, do I give all this up? At the same time, I think he knows, but ultimately I have to obey God. Right. And I think that's where
and that's where it becomes challenging. Did I make this up? Did I dream this? Or making sure that I do this right. Yeah, we might come back to this because hopefully we'll take a couple minutes at the end of this and talk a little bit about, because it's still very much a thing that people have mystical experiences in prayer. And actually I know there are people in this room that could be able to share experiences. I do too, plenty. So that we could be able to talk a little bit about that. Not quite as dramatic as what we encounter here, but there's some things that overlap. Okay, and I know I'm jumping around a lot, guys, but right now, again, this is just trying to get you a sense of there was this moment and this one, and then once we get kind of a sense of different ways that God speaks, we're going to have the tools that we need to be able to go into Revelation, right? Okay. So I'm going to jump forward quite a bit to one of the next important figures. We've already done the Old Testament, or we've already done from Genesis Joseph. Now we've just done Moses, and Moses had a special vision. That was like one of his big visions, right? It was this burning bush. Let's jump forward. We're going to talk about David. So we're going to go to the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 12. So that's quite a bit. We're jumping quite a bit. 2 Samuel chapter 12. And this is a different sort of thing, but I'm including it because I think it's important that we see this. Okay, context. Does everybody know this story about David and Bathsheba? Everybody, show of hands. You all know the story of David and Bathsheba? Okay, quick recap on the story of David and Bathsheba. David was being naughty. Very. David's king. And he's up on his palace walls, and he's looking around, and he sees a hot chick bathing over on the next roof over.
Right. Accidentally.
Oh yeah, absolutely. At which point he says, "Yeah, I'm gonna have that." So they finds out that she's actually married. So then he draws her in, tells her, "You're gonna sleep with me." She does, and then he gets her pregnant. And then, in order to cover up his tracks, because she's married, right? She tries to get the husband to come back and sleep with her, but he's busy on campaign and says, "No, I'm too busy on campaign. I can't go back to be able to, be with my wife there." So now it's like, well, now it's too late, right? Like, you can't just blame it on the husband. So now that she's pregnant, it's going to have to do. So he decides that the best way to be able to deal with this situation is to get the husband killed by putting him out into where the fighting was the fiercest. So he basically has a man murdered, right? So David has been very naughty in this. Chapter 11 outlines that, and the end of the last sentence on my version of this says, "But what David had done displeased the Lord." Yes, it did. Yes, it did. Okay, so in response to this, the Lord sent the prophet Nathan to David. So here, again, we're much later on in the Bible. Now God's people are all settled. David is king. David has been abusing his power. He's been acting naughty, as we've been saying here. The prophet of God goes and gives this message to the king, right? He says, "King, I have a message for you. There was in this one town," you almost can hear him starting off, like once upon a time, right? Yeah. There was in this town 2 men, one rich, one poor. The rich man had flocks and herds in great abundance, and the poor man had nothing but 1 ewe lamb, only a single little lamb, which he had bought. He fostered it, and it grew up with him and his children, eating his bread and drinking from his cup, sleeping in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. When a traveler came to stay, the rich man would not take anything from his own flock or herd to provide for the wayfarer who had come. Instead, he stole the poor man's lamb and prepared that for his guest. David flew into a great rage. He says, "As the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die for doing such a thing, and having shown no pity. He shall make 4-fold restitution for the lamb." And Nathan said to David, "You are that man." So, right. Now, again, how do you be able to correct a king when the king is going to chop your head off if because he's already proven that he's going to murder, over this situation, right? So Nathan is actually being very brave, but also very clever, right? Because he comes and he says, "I have a story to tell you," right? And then David is trapped by his own words, right? Okay. This is more like a parable, right? It's a story that teaches a lesson. It uses animal figures, right? And we've already seen some of that idea, like the cows, right? We already talked about the cows coming up, and there was the fat cows and then the skinny cows, and we talked a little bit about that. It's teaching a lesson. Now, obviously, it seems to me this is very, very obviously a parable, right? I mean, this is not based off from a real life story. This is a symbolic representation, right? David is the rich man who stole the other man's, little, lamb and ate it and stuff like that. And that's what represents what he did to Uriah by stealing his wife Bathsheba and then killing him. So it's not a dream or vision, but it is a symbolic story. It's a story that's using symbolic representations, right? The same way that we said the 7 cows that were the fat cows represented the 7 years of plenty, and then the 7 cows that were the sick cows were the 7 cows that represented the years of lean, right? Of famine. So there was like a symbolic representation that was happening here, right? So what's happening here? It's almost like what began as sort of like the tradition of understanding and trying to understand, interpret dreams, now is being used to create stories, But they're using the same techniques, right? Animals represent for humans, right? And different things represent for different things, right? Keep that in mind because that is going to be important as we go along with more of these kind of examples. Okay. I'm running through all these. Does anybody have any questions, or please pipe up if you have any questions, or if anything is unclear, or.
Nathan is a good prophet. He comes from God.
Yes, Nathan is a good prophet.
There are some bad prophets.
Yes.
But Nathan is a good prophet, and he comes from God, and he brings them this message. Yeah.
Right. He brings this message, and he outwits the king, and it's yeah.
But
Good.
I have to like David because David teaches us about reconciliation. Because when you look at all the patterns of his life over and over again, and he screws up and he makes mistakes and then he does better, and
Yeah.
you know.
He does. It's a good thing about, again, David is a bad king, but David is also a good king. And it's like, well, most of us can represent to that, that it's like we make bad decisions, but then, God can be able to get us back onto the path, right? Well, that's part of what Nathaniel does, is like he gets him back onto the path.
Because it is the house of David that Jesus.
Right. David, yeah.
Yeah.
Jesus comes from the house and the line of David, right? That's the one who receives the promise of the kingdom, right?
And Solomon's the one who builds the temple, who comes out of this bad relationship.
Yeah, exactly.
Builds up
Also
the
true.
temple of the city and, yeah.
The child of their affair is the one that becomes the new king. Which really, again, God chooses odd, circumstances.
He's got a plan.
He's got a plan. It's definitely not our plan, right?
This said the child dies.
The child, the second.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's the second one from. Thank you. He ends up marrying Bathsheba, and then they later have a child. Thank you. That's correct. That is correct.
Oh,
Yeah, but
I appreciate the
it
correction.
didn't all come about in the nicest
Not at
way.
all.
that's right. It's,
No. Yeah.
Oh, there it is, Solomon. I found it.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
Solomon.
Several years ago, when we were in the Holy Land, they took us to where the tomb of David is.
Uh-huh.
Oh.
And the people in our group were putting their hands up on the tomb. There's a big old metal, overgrown coffin, I call it.
Mhm.
And I had a hard time trying to figure out what to do was right.
Mhm.
Because I didn't study and whatever, I knew what David was and I knew what he did.
Mhm.
But I didn't realize the forgiveness of
Yeah.
God's forgiveness for him. And I had a hard time going there to pray
Yeah.
at his tomb.
Yeah.
And I said, what am I doing here? What is, the priest that was with us, I didn't get a chance to visit with him about it. I said, this is not, it didn't.
Don't know exactly what to do with
reconcile
that.
in my head, but
Yeah.
later, the last few years, when I've been getting more into the Bible, understanding more about God's forgiveness, God forgave him. And then if you look at it, there's other people that God forgave that had committed all kinds of atrocities.
Yeah.
And went on, but at that time, I wasn't too keen on going praying at David's tomb.
Well,
No,
even
fair
when-
enough.
When David was building up his kingdom, when he was barreling through all those different regions and conquering them and everything, he didn't always use the best techniques. He just had the ultimate goal in mind.
Let's take a look at a couple Psalms. I'm going to look at Psalm 22 and Psalm 23 because these also use imagery that again is going to be useful for us. We've just been talking about the idea of using animals as a representation for humans, right? Right, like we just said, that there was, like in the story that we were just talking about, right? The lamb, right? The little lamb. What did that represent? Well, that represented the Bathsheba, right? The wife, right? Or again, the animals could represent things like, years of plenty and years of famine, right? So the idea of like animals and different sort of natural things substituting in. Let me read through Psalm 22 here. And you can be able to hear a little bit of that happening, right? Okay, so this one is a downer psalm. So there's not. Okay. it's a song of sadness, right? It gets to eventually, but it starts off, and it begins this way. My God, why have you forsaken me? The words of my groaning do nothing to save me. My God, I call out by day, you don't answer. At night, I find no respite. Yet you, the Holy One, who make your home in the praises of Israel, and our ancestors put their trust in you. They trusted in you. You set them free. To you they called for help. They were delivered. In you they trusted. They will not be put to shame. But I'm a worm and no man, a scorn of mankind, contempt of the people. All who see me jeer at me. They sneer and they wag their heads. He trusted himself to the Lord. Let the Lord set him free. Let him deliver him if he looks such delight upon him. It was you who drew me from the womb and soothed me from my mother's breast. On you I was cast from my birth. From the womb I belong to you. Do not hold aloft. Trouble is upon me. No one can help me. Many bulls are circling me. The wild bulls of Bashan closing in on me. Lions ravening and roaring. They open their jaws at me. My strength is trickling away. My bones are all disjointed. My heart has turned to wax melting inside me. My mouth is as dry as earthenware. My tongue sticks to my jaw. You lay me down in the dust of death. A pack of dogs surrounds me. A gang of villains closing in on me. As if to hack off my hands and my feet and count every one of my bones while they look on and gloat. They divide my garments among them, and they cast lots for my clothing. Lord, do not hold aloft. My strength, come quick to help me. Rescue my soul from the sword, the one life I have from the grasp of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, my poor life from the wild bull's horns. I shall proclaim your name to my brothers, praise you in the full assembly. You who fear the Lord, praise him. All the race of Jacob, honor him. Revere him, all the race of Israel. For he has not despised nor disregarded the poverty of the poor. He has not turned away his face, but has listened to the cry for help. Of you is my praise in the assembly. I will perform my vows before all who fear him. The poor will eat and be filled. Those who seek the Lord will praise him. May your heart live forever. The whole wide world will remember and return to the Lord. All the families of nations bow down before him. For to the Lord, the ruler of nations, belongs kingly power. All who prosper on earth will bow before him. All who go down to the dust will do reverence before him. All those who are dead, their descendants will serve him, will proclaim his name from generation to still to come. Those will tell of the saving justice to your people yet unborn. He has fulfilled it. Okay. So the basic run of this is that it starts off, the guy is in terrible situation, right? But eventually he says, I trust in you, O Lord. I trust in you, O Lord. And eventually, Lord, I will praise you because you're gonna help me, right? Right? And there's some sense like maybe this was even written after the fact, after he got the help, right? And so he's like, I used to be like, a worm and no man, right? But now I can praise you, O Lord, and all peoples will praise you, right? The Psalms are often attributed to David. Now, David didn't write all of them, but maybe there's a tradition that goes back that says David was involved with the writing of the Psalms. So maybe this was David or somebody like David, who was in a troubling situation and then got help and then was praising the Lord. But in the middle of it, I hope you noticed. What did they say? He said he was surrounded by dogs, lions, and wild bulls, right? These were the animals that were surrounding him, right? Now, it's clear in here, right? They're not actually animals, right? They're either representations of people or situations, right? Maybe he's going through sickness or some poverty or some terrible calamity that's happening, or he has enemies that are hunting him in some way. And so these are all represented by these animals, right? The wild bulls, the dogs, the lions, right? Another psalm that has to do with animals and kind of representing humans, right? Psalm 23, the Good Shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. In grassy meadows he lets me lie down. By tranquil streams he leads me to restore my spirit. He guides me in paths of saving justice as befits his name. All right. So, I mean, what's the idea here, right? Like, the guy who's writing this is saying, I'm a sheep, right? Like that you know, the Lord is my shepherd, so what does that mean? I'm a sheep, right? And all of that, he lets me be by tranquil sweet streams, right? And the reason why that's important is, like, sheep are pretty dumb, and you put them into fast-running water, and they will get waterlogged with all of the water in their wool, and then they will get too heavy to move, and then they will, like, get drowned. So you have to take them to tranquil streams. Otherwise, they're going to kill themselves because they're too stupid to get out of the water. Okay. So then the shepherd is leading them, and it says at first he says he walks them through green pastures, but then it says, even if I were to walk into a ravine as dark as death, I should not have no fear of danger, for you are at my side. Your staff, your crook are there to soothe me. You prepare a table for me under the eyes of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. The cup brims over. So now the sheep thing has gone away, and now he's sitting at a table, right? Kindness and faithful love, your kindness and faithful love pursue me every day of my life. I make my home in the house of the Lord for all time to come, right? So the Psalms easily interchange back and forth between animals and people or other sorts of representations, right?
Well, also in Psalm 22, when it says that you divide my garments and
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's like for a lot.
That's what
Yeah,
they did.
Jesus.
It is.
Jesus quotes Psalm 22 while he's on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Right? And so, like, imagine the cross, and he's saying, my God, why have you forsaken me, right? And then you can hear the echoes of the rest of Psalm 22, right? I'm surrounded by dogs, by the lions that will attack me. I'm pierced. They have pierced my side. I can count all my bones, right? Like, all of that, right? That eventually leads to the praising God, but it's the going through the cross, you know?
This is the Bible that the youth use, and
Yeah.
before that it says to the leader, according to the deer of the dawn. What does that mean?
According to probably means, like, so there was probably notes written above it telling you what melody you were supposed to sing it to. And so the Deer of the Dawn was probably the name of the song that you were supposed to use as the melody, but we have no idea what that melody was or what that original song was.
Those are all instructions, and sometimes they tell like a musical instrument or something, but we don't know what all that.
Yeah,
it has.
it's like musical notation, and it's like, you know, nobody knows what the musical notation is supposed to be now, you know.
Deer there, so. Okay.
Yeah. The doe of the morning. You know, again, it probably was the tune of the song, you know. The same way that you could say, you know, I don't know. I can't think of a,
Neither.
you know.
Yeah.
If you had a popular song, you know, Mary Had a Little Lamb, right? So you'd be like, you know, sing it to the tune of Mary Had a Little Lamb, right? It's like, you know, okay. Shall we move forward?
Yes.
All right. We're going to look at the prophet Isaiah. So move forward to the book of Isaiah, chapter 6. Okay. All right. The call of Isaiah. Chapter 6. So Isaiah is one of the prophets, right? And he has this vision. So we're gonna see this vision of Isaiah the prophet. Okay. In the year of King Uzziah's death, Isaiah, right? I saw the Lord seated on a high and lofty throne. His train filled the sanctuary, right? So his robe, right? So huge that it filled the entire room, right? Above him stood seraphs, angels, burning with fire. Seraph actually literally means like it's an angel, but it means an angel that's on fire, right? Like that's what it means. It's a burning one. Above him stood seraphs. Each one had 6 wings, 2 covering its face, 2 covering its feet, and 2 for flying. And they were shouting these words to each other: "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of Lord Sabaoth. His glory fills the whole world. The doorposts shook at the sound of the shouting, and the temple was filled with smoke. Then I said, woe is me, I am lost. I'm a man of unclean lips. I live among people of unclean lips. And my eyes have seen the King, the Lord. Then one of the seraphs flew up to me. Which, by the way, like, you remember how those things were described? Right? They're flaming angels with 6 wings, covering their face, covering their feet, and flying, right? And one of them flies up to him. And I've mentioned this before in some of my homilies. Like he says, he says, "Woe is me!" Right? For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Right? There's a tradition in the Old Testament to look upon the face of God is to die. Right? Because it's just going to be too overwhelming. Right? So he's like, "Well, that's it. I'm a goner." Right? Like, and I have unclean lips, so he knows his own. That sins. Yes, that's the right way to say it. So then one of the seraphs flew to me, holding in his hand a live coal, which he had taken from the altar with a pair of tongs, and with this he touched it to my mouth. Then he said, look, this has touched your lips, your guilt is removed, and your sin is forgiven. Then I heard the voice of the Lord say, whom shall I send? Who will go for us? And I said, here I am. Send me. He said, go and say to my people, listen and listen, but never understand. Look and look, but never perceive. Make this people's hearts coarse, make their ears dull, shut their eyes tight, or else they will see. Use their eyes to see, use their ears to hear, use their hearts to understand, and change their ways and be healed. And then I said, until when, Lord? And he replied, until the towns are in ruins and deserted, houses unattended, and the great desolation reigns over the land. And the Lord has driven the people away, and the country is totally abandoned. Then, when 1/10 of them are left, that will be stripped again, like the terebinth, like the oak cut back to the stock. Their stock is a holy seed. Okay. So, lovely.
What does it mean?
What does it mean, right?
Wow.
All right.
That's a lot.
God is telling, so first of all, we want to notice here, we've switched from images of nature, animals, right? Stars, we've seen before stars and animals and the moon and the sun and right and different kinds of plants, right? We've seen some of those sorts of things, but we've now switched over to a vision of the temple, right? Important because that's gonna happen a lot in the book of Revelation. We're gonna see the temple a lot, right? God's temple. He sees a vision of God's temple. He thinks he's gonna die. Then the seraph comes and touches him with fire, right? And he becomes purified. And it's a fire that doesn't burn, right? Which, if you're paying attention, that was Moses, right? It's the fire that purifies, but that's the presence of the Lord, but doesn't burn, right? Doesn't destroy. So the burning one now comes and lights him on fire, right? And then he's able to, but then that purifies him, right? And then he's able to go, and God says, who will I send to my people? And he says, here I am, Lord, send me. Isaiah says, I will go and bring your message. And so what is God's message? God's message is, go tell my people all of the things that they need to hear, but they will not listen. Go and tell my people, say, look and look, but never understand. Make the people listen and listen, but never perceive, right? God's people are going to, basically God has come to the conclusion that God's people are going to be punished, right? So his job is to come and say, nope, too late, guys. Punishment is coming upon you. And yeah, that's what Isaiah does. He comes and he says, this is, here's the punishment of the Lord coming upon you, and the country is destroyed. This is the time of the exile, Right? The people are conquered by one of the neighboring empires. I think at this time it's the Babylonians. Persians? Babylonians. And the people are conquered. And Isaiah basically kind of just goes to them and says, for your sins, this is what's going to happen, right? It's judgment upon you, right? So that's what is going on here. And that's why he says, God says, go tell them this message of destruction, right? And he says, until when, Lord? Until the towns are in ruins, right? So but he says it's going to be stripped down to, what does it say here? The country will be totally abandoned, and suppose 1/10 of them are left in, it will be stripped again like the terebinth, like the oak, cut back to the stalk. Their stalk is a holy seed. So it's like they're going to be cut all the way back to the trunk. But that trunk, that seed is still the holy seed. So God's going to rebuild it again. But it's like, nope, we got to clear it all off, and then we'll rebuild again. Something like that. Just to give the flip side of that, let's go to Isaiah chapter 40.
Would this have been after Noah? Noah's on-
Far after Noah, yes.
Oh.
Noah's in Genesis. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it makes you wonder what signs we're having in the world now.
I know, right?
Cities
That's-
burning, states burning.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's actually, that'll be an interesting set of topics that we'll have when we get into Revelations, because
Yeah,
it kind
I
of,
know it.
it's that same sort of, that's one of the jobs of the prophets, is to tell people, right, like, if you don't follow God's commands, bad things are going to happen, right? The judgment of God will come upon you, right? And we don't have time to get into that today, but yes, that's a thing that we'll get into.
Okay.
All
Moving right along.
right, but starting in chapter 40 of the book of the prophet Isaiah. So that back in chapter 6, Isaiah was telling the people that the exile was going to happen because they were going to be punished, right? This is now years and years later, decades later. The country's already been destroyed, the people have already been sent into exile, and now Isaiah has a new message. The Lord sends him to go out and say this: console my people. Console them, says your God. Speak to the heart of Jerusalem and cry to her and tell her that her period of slavery is ended and their guilt has been atoned for, and that from the hand of the Lord she's received double punishment for her sins. A voice cries, "Prepare in the desert a way for the Lord. Make straight highway for our God across the wastelands. Let every valley be filled in, every mountain hill be leveled, every cliff become a plateau, every escarpment a plain. Then the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all humanity will see it together, for the mouth of the Lord has spoken." Right? Okay, we could go on and on. Actually, this is a pretty familiar passage if you know kind of Isaiah and the prophecies about the coming of the Messiah and so forth. But its first interpretation was that once God's people were sent into exile, that was their punishment, as it were, right? But now God is telling Isaiah, go back and go tell my people, you will be forgiven, right? And we'll bring you back home. And then the imagery that's used here is like landscape imagery, right? So it's like, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight a road for our God. So the valleys, right, where the ground goes deep down into a valley, right? The valleys, they're going to be filled in, right? Why? Because we need a straight road, right? The mountains, we're just going to get them out of the way. We're going to flatten them down, right? The wastelands where there's no roads and everything's just, wandering around and stuff like that. Nope, we're going to straighten it all out and be able to create this road. What does that mean? Was there literally a road that was made? No, it wasn't literally a road that was made. But the message was God's going to create a straight path to be able to bring you back home to where you're supposed to be, right? So, but the symbolism here is what? That mountains, right? Landscapes, entire landscapes are going to be transformed so that God can be able to accomplish his plans, right? Again, we will see this happening again in the book of Revelations, that there will be entire, oceans and mountains and, huge landscapes that are going to be absolutely, totally, transformed and altered and stuff like that. That's building on this tradition, right? That goes here, we find it in Isaiah and other places as well. That's way, how do we interpret that, right? Well, at least in Isaiah, what we're seeing is that it's a sort of a metaphor for God preparing the way for his people, right? But using landscape metaphors to do it, right? Does that make sense? Okay. We're going to move on. Let's move on to Jesus. Let's do, right? Have we had enough of the prophets? A little unsettling, right? But again, they're unsettling, but they're meant to wake people up, right? Like that's part of the reason why there's these bigger than life kind of explanations. It's like it's waking people up, like this is serious, right? So.
But is that trying to say that there's always forgiveness? Is that kind of
That's the second part of Isaiah. Yeah, definitely.
that there's always forgiveness?
That there's always
Destroy
forgiveness.
You, but then you can. I want to help you again.
Right. And it's a thing that goes just pattern by pattern by pattern by pattern. Like it repeats all throughout the Bible is like God will bring punishments, but the punishments are there not to destroy God's people, but to destroy their sin. Right? The kingdom had to be destroyed. Why did the kingdom have to be destroyed? Because it was corrupt. Right? Because the people had failed to live up to, the ways of God, right? So then the kingdom was destroyed. But God didn't destroy his entire people. No. Once the corrupt kingdom was destroyed, then he was able to bring them back, and the remnant was able to come back together and be faithful to the Lord, right? So, and it's the same sort of thing that happens in our own lives, right? Like, we do things that are, sins and things that are bad for us and harm relationships with ourselves and other people. And it's like, well, judgment will come upon you because eventually you're going to have to pay the consequences for your decisions, right? And so the consequences will come upon you, judgment will come upon you, but God is not doing it to kill you. He's doing it to be able to purify, right? So that's kind of the idea of the judgments that are happening here. We'll get into that a lot when we get to the book of Revelation. Yeah.
Well, and at the very end of what you're reading, it says, like a shepherd, he feeds his flock in his arms. He gathers the lambs, carrying them in his bosom, and leading the ewes with care.
He's the good shepherd.
He's the good shepherd. Psalm 22, as David was being the bad shepherd, by stealing the ewes, but here's God being the good shepherd by caring for the ewes, right? So it's a lot of connection that happens in here. Again, a lot of these images are things that we're going to see, lambs, lions, wild bull, mountains, seas, the temple, right? Like all of these things are part of the tradition that come into the book of Revelation. So that's why we're kind of trying to get a sense of all that, because this is all the language, the words, the imagery that we're going to need to understand the book of Revelation. Okay. Real quick, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one because we are more familiar with these ones, I think, the parables of Jesus. Right now, I'm in the Gospel of Matthew. Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13. Jesus said, so pay attention to the parable of the sower. I'm sorry. Let me start here. The people were standing by the shore. This is on verse 1. The people were standing on the shore, and he told them many things in parables. He said, listen, a sower went out to sow. When he sowed, some seed fell on the edge of the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Others fell on patches of rock where they found it in the soil and sprang up at once because there was no depth of the earth. But soon the sun came up, and it was scorched, not having any roots. Others fell among thorns, and the thorns grew up and choked them. Others fell on rich soil and produced their crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. Anyone who has ears should listen, right? Jesus then goes on to explain his parable, right? And he says, that the different types of grain falling on the ground, different types of seed growing into the ground, and the way that they grow represents what? Different kinds of people, right? Some people accept it very quickly, but then they get scorched because they don't follow through with it. Some of it, the seed grows up, but then it gets choked out by the thorns. And he says that's the people who they hear the word of God, but then they let other concerns choke it out so that it can't grow properly, right? He says these are the different kinds of people, and the seed is the word of God, right? So Jesus is very clearly here doing the similar sort of storytelling as we've heard already before, right? Plants, natural things of the countryside, they represent people or different kinds of people, right? And then he's also trying to teach a lesson, right? So it's the same kind of way as what we saw with the prophet Nathaniel, right? About the lamb and the two men and the lamb and stuff like that. He's trying to teach a lesson, right? How do you properly receive the word of God, right? Like he says, and what's going to be the fruits and the benefits of that. So he talks about that. I'm not going to go into all the details of it, though he does have an Isaiah moment in here where he says, for those who have ears, they won't listen, and for those who have eyes, they won't see, right? It's like, it's that very much, it sounds like a negative thing, but it's that whole Isaiah thing of the people who are not going to listen, they're going to have judgment, but, hopefully then that'll turn around to things being better, right? Now, Jesus uses lots of parables. So he's very well versed in the history of all of this, right? In the language that was used in the Bible about these kinds of stories. So parables are one thing, right? What about visions, right? So let's move to Matthew chapter 24. Okay, I'm just going to start on verse 15. I could start in a couple different places because there's a whole bunch of delightful stuff in this chapter. It says, "So when you see the appalling abomination of which the prophet Daniel spoke, set up in the holy place," let the reader understand, "then those in Judea must escape to the mountains. If anyone is on the housetop, he must not come in to collect his belongings from his house. If anyone is in the field, he must not return back to fetch his cloak. Alas for those with child or those with babies at the breast when the day comes. Pray that you will not have to make your escape in winter or on the Sabbath, for then there will be great distress unparalleled since the world began, and such as will never be again. And if that time had not been shortened, no human being would have survived. But shortened that time shall be for the sake of those who are chosen." He then, a little bit later on, I'm looking at verse 29 here. "Immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken, and the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heavens. And then too all people of the earth will beat their breasts, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet to gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heaven to the other." Yeah, we'll go with that for now. So this is kind of a vision, right? Prophecy, right? Definitely a little bit of like the Isaiah, the prophet, telling the tale of destruction that will come upon the people. God's judgment will come upon the nation and stuff like that. But on the other hand, we also see this imagery of like the stars in the heavens being, cast down, and the sun being darkened and stuff like that. So, and where have we seen that kind of imagery, right? That kind of imagery was not in the historical prophets. That was like in, when we talked about, stars and stuff like that before, that was in the dreams, right? That was way back with Joseph, and his dreams, right? Okay, so when Jesus is talking about this, he seems to be going back and forth between sometimes using historical type language and sometimes using metaphorical or symbolic dream type language, right? Kind of going back and forth between the two. Because again, that's all part of the Jewish tradition, so he was very comfortable in using different methods of speech to be able to describe what it was that he was trying. And in fact, all of this in chapter 24 begins with, and this is significant, it begins with the verse 1 of chapter 24 says, Jesus left the temple, and he was going away, and his disciples came up to him and drew attention to the temple building. And he said to them in reply, you see all of these, pointing to the temple. In truth, I tell you, not a single stone here will be left upon another. Everything will be pulled down. All right. So what's the some of the meaning behind this? It's like all of this stuff that he's talking about, the days of great destruction, that has never been seen upon the world, and the sun will be darkened, and the stars will be cast down from the sky, and things like that. That's all done in context of what he's saying is going to happen to the temple in Jerusalem. All right. Now, is there a double meaning to this? Is he also talking about the end of the world? Yes, I think so, and we'll get to that, sort of the double meanings that happen in some of these scripture passages. But the original, or the immediate meaning of it seems to be, right, what are the days of destruction that will come upon the world? Well, it's the days that will happen when the city of Jerusalem is destroyed and the temple is destroyed, right? And it's using this apocalyptic language of the end of the stars and stuff like that. But Jesus also says this is going to happen within a generation. And coincidentally, it does. Roman army shows up and tears down Jerusalem and the temple within 40 years. So, historically, we know that happened. But we do see, some of this kind of imagery. And again, some of it is like the prophets, which seems much more historical, like God's judgment's going to come. And that's like a very historical, practical thing, The armies of your enemies are going to show up and be God's instrument of judgment, right? But then the other ones seem to be more like the dream, way of looking at things, where it's like it's got a metaphorical or symbolic meaning to it, right? So Jesus seems to go back and forth between these two in a way that, again, he seems comfortable with using both of these sorts of language because it's all part of the Jewish tradition that he would have been very strong with. Maybe one last one. I'm not going to read through the whole thing because I think we know it pretty well. This one is in Matthew 25, so really it's just like a page forward, a page or two forward maybe. And it starts on verse 31, the end of chapter 25, starting in verse 31. The last judgment. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, escorted by all of the angels, he will take his seat on the throne of glory. Now, what does this sound like? This sounds like that vision from Isaiah, right? The temple vision, right? And all the nations will be assembled before him, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. So now Jesus is both using temple imagery and countryside imagery of sheep and goats, right? Okay, so great. And then the king, the one who's sitting on the throne of heaven, will say to those on the right hand, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, take as your heritage the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you made me welcome," so on and so forth. And they will say, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty?" And so on and so forth. And the king will answer, "In truth I tell you, insofar as you did this to the least of my brothers, you did it to me." Right? And then he says to those on his left the opposite, right? When I was hungry, you gave me no food. When I was thirsty, you gave me no drink. When I was a stranger, you gave me no welcome. Lord, when did we see you as such a way? Whenever you rejected the least of my brothers, you did it for me, right? So again, we're seeing here, again, as we get further and further along in the Bible, it's like more and more layers of things that are happening, right? So it's like, well, is this a temple vision? Yeah, it's a temple vision, and there's the one sitting on the throne, right? You know, the Son of Man sitting on the throne. But is it also an animal story, right? With like animal, kind of is, yeah, because we've got the sheep and the goats, right, going on here, right? Well, is this a prediction of the future? Well, it is saying it's the judgment of the nations, right? So that's a thing that theoretically, all the nations will be judged at the end of time, right? This is like about getting into the kingdom of heaven, right? So that's a future prediction, right? But at the same time, wait a minute, is this a story that's supposed to be a parable that teaches us a lesson, right? And it's obviously that, right? It's obviously that. It does teach us a lesson. So it's like, well, what is this thing? Well, it turns out it's like there's a lot of layers on this. And it's like, as we've gone through the Bible, through the history of God's people, like all of these different parts of the prophetic tradition of the prophets and the stories and the symbolic stories and the dreams and the messages and the oracles and all of these things, they end up kind of layering on top of each other to the time that we get to the New Testament, get to Jesus, right? You can get this story, and it's really complex. It's got a lot of different layers of things that's going on here, right? It's sort of historical. It's sort of a parable. It's sort of a prediction of the future. It's sort of a dream. It's sort of like it's got all of these different layers to it. And, you don't exclude any one. Well, which one's the real one? Well, you don't have to exclude any of them, right? Real. Right? They're all real, right? Okay, that is as good a place as we can be able to get to, I think, as a preparation for the book of Revelation. When we get into the book of Revelation, we are going to find that all of these layers that we've been talking about are going to be present in the book of Revelation. And all of them, from the historical prophetic tradition about saying God's judgment is going to come upon the people that are unfaithful, to the dreamlike ones where it's trying to where everything is described in these kind of terms of animals or landscapes or the stars in the sky and the sun and the moon, or there'll be there'll be lessons about how to live our life better, right? But then there's also going to be these intense encounters with God that are being described, like Moses at the burning bush, right? And like Moses at the burning bush, he learned God's name, right? There in this encounter of the burning bush. Big deal, learning the name of God. It's like in the book of Revelations, there's going to be those sorts of moments too, where it's like you come across and you have this encounter with God, and it's something that's so hard to put into words, but yet it has this huge thing, and so there's this layer of prayer and mysticism that's in it as well. Okay. Any questions?